The sound of splintering wood echoed across the O'Brien ranch as another section of the barn roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated debris from the 3-day tempest that had finally passed through the Dragoon Mountains. Margaret O'Brien stood in the mud-soaked yard, her weathered hands gripping the wooden fence post so tightly her knuckles had turned white, watching 20 years of her late husband's work crumble before her eyes. The storm had been unlike anything the Arizona Territory had seen in decades, bringing with it hailstones the size of chicken eggs and winds that howled like banshees through the canyon walls. Now, in the eerie calm that followed, the devastation was complete. 43 head of cattle lay scattered across the valley floor, their bodies twisted and broken, while the survivors huddled in whatever shelter they could find among the rocky outcroppings. Thomas O'Brien emerged from behind the collapsed water tower, his boots squelching in the thick mud that had once been their main corral. At 22, he possessed the lean, weathered build of a man who had spent his entire life working cattle in the unforgiving Arizona sun, but today his shoulders sagged with defeat. Blood trickled from a cut above his left eyebrow where a flying piece of timber had struck him during his desperate attempt to save the remaining livestock. "Ma, we lost more than half the herd," he called out, his voice barely audible over the sound of settling debris. "The ones that lived won't last long without proper shelter, and the well's been contaminated with all this runoff." Samuel, his younger brother by 3 years, appeared from the remains of what had been their grain storage, shaking his head in disbelief. Unlike Thomas, who had inherited their father's serious demeanor, Samuel had always been the one to find humor in even the darkest. Margaret turned to face her sons, and for the first time since Patrick O'Brien had died of consumption 2 winters ago, she felt the full weight of their isolation settling upon her like a suffocating blanket. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away across treacherous mountain terrain, and the town of Tombstone, where they conducted their business, lay 30 miles to the south through Apache territory that had grown increasingly hostile in recent months. Situations, but now his usual smile was nowhere to be found. "The bank note's due in 6 weeks, she said quietly, her Irish accent still thick despite 25 years in the territory. "Without the cattle, we've got nothing to sell, and Jameson won't extend the loan again." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, carrying with them the implicit understanding that the O'Brien Ranch, established by Patrick in 1857 with nothing but determination and a pregnant wife, was about to become another casualty of the harsh Arizona wilderness. Thomas kicked at a piece of twisted metal that had once been part of their brand-new windmill, a Christmas gift Margaret had surprised the family with using money saved from their best year yet. "There's got to be something we can do," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Pa didn't build this place just so we could lose it to the first real storm that came along." His words carried the frustration of a young man who had watched his father work himself to death trying to carve a life out of this unforgiving land, only to see it all threatened by circumstances beyond their control. Samuel was examining the damage to their horse Coral when something unusual caught his attention. Their prize stallion, a magnificent Mustang they called Whisper due to his unnaturally quiet movements, was behaving strangely. The horse stood perfectly still in the center of the damaged enclosure, his head raised high and his ears swiveling back and forth as if listening to sounds that the humans couldn't hear. What made the behavior even more peculiar was that Whisper's attention seemed focused on a specific point in the mountains to the east, toward the sacred peaks that the Apache considered the dwelling place of their ancestors. "Ma, come look at this," Samuel called, his voice carrying a note of curiosity that hadn't been there moments before. Margaret and Thomas approached the corral, their boots sliding in the muddy ground as they tried to understand what had captured their younger son's attention. Whisper was a horse unlike any other they had known, a gift from Patrick's Apache friend, a medicine man named Nayati who had visited the ranch regularly until his death the previous spring. The stallion's behavior had always been somewhat mystical, seeming to possess an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural, but what they were witnessing now went beyond his usual uncanny awareness. Whisper began pawing at the ground in a specific pattern, 3 scratches followed by 2, then a single long gouge in the earth, repeating the sequence over and over again with mechanical precision. "I've never seen him do anything like that before," Thomas observed, watching as the horse continued his strange ritual. "It's almost like he's trying to tell us something." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air that followed the storm. Growing up in County Cork, she had heard stories from her grandmother about animals that served as messengers between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits, but she had dismissed such tales as superstitious nonsense until she came to Arizona and witnessed firsthand the deep spiritual connection that existed between the Apache people and the natural world. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts, and all three O'Briens turned toward the muddy trail that led from their ranch to the main road. A lone rider was approaching, moving slowly and deliberately through the aftermath of the storm. As the figure drew closer, they could see it was Jake Morrison, their nearest neighbor and one of the few men in the territory who had managed to maintain peaceful relations with both the white settlers and the Apache tribes. Morrison was a grizzled veteran of the Mexican War who had arrived in Arizona Territory in 1865 with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a burning desire to forget what he had seen at Gettysburg. Over the years, he had built a modest spread in the valley below the O'Brien Ranch, and his reputation for fairness and honesty had made him something of an unofficial mediator in disputes between the various factions that called this harsh land home. "Margaret, boys," he called out as he dismounted near the remains of their front gate. "Heard the storm hit you folks pretty hard. Thought I'd ride up and see if there was anything I could do to help." His weathered face showed genuine concern as he surveyed the destruction that surrounded them, and Margaret felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. In a land where neighbors were scarce and help even scarcer, Morrison's willingness to make the dangerous journey through storm-ravaged territory spoke volumes about his character. Thomas stepped forward to shake the older man's hand. "Much obliged, Mr. Morrison. We lost most of the herd and pretty much everything else." As he spoke, Whisper's behavior became even more agitated, and the horse began making a low, guttural sound that none of them had ever heard before. The sound seemed to resonate through the mountain air, creating an almost hypnotic effect that made all four humans turn their attention toward the magnificent animal. Morrison's expression changed instantly when he saw what Whisper was doing. His weather-beaten face went pale, and he crossed himself in the manner of a man who had suddenly encountered something beyond his understanding. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I ain't seen behavior like that since I rode with Nayate's band during the Apache Wars." The mention of the dead medicine man's name caused Whisper to suddenly stop pawing at the ground and turn his intelligent eyes directly toward Morrison, as if the horse understood every word that had been spoken. "You knew Nayate?" Margaret asked, surprised by this revelation. Despite their years as neighbors, Morrison had never mentioned any connection to the Apache leader who had been such an important part of their lives. The medicine man had been Patrick's closest friend, a relationship that had begun when Nayate had helped Patrick recover from a near-fatal encounter with a mountain lion in the early days of the ranch. Morrison nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Whisper's intense gaze. "Nayate and I had what you might call an understanding. During the troubles with Geronimo's band, I helped him get word to the army about which groups were hostile and which ones just wanted to be left alone to live in peace." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully before continuing. "In return, he taught me some of the old ways, including how to read the signs that animals give us when they're trying to communicate something important." The implications of Morrison's words settled over the O'Brien family like a heavy blanket. If Whisper was indeed trying to communicate something important, as Morrison seemed to suggest, then perhaps their situation wasn't as hopeless as it appeared. Samuel, always the most optimistic of the three, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "What do you think he's trying to tell us?" he asked, gesturing toward the horse who had now begun walking in tight circles, always stopping at the same point and facing toward the eastern mountains. Morrison watched the animal's movements with the intensity of a man reading a map, his years of experience with Apache customs allowing him to interpret behavior that would have seemed random to most white settlers. According to Nayate, horses like Whisper are born with a connection to the spirit world that most animals lose as they grow older, Morrison explained, his voice taking on the reverent tone of a man discussing sacred matters. "But this one's different. Nayate told me once that Whisper could see things that were hidden from human eyes, paths that led to places where the past and present come together." As if responding to the mention of his mystical abilities, Whisper suddenly reared up on his hind legs and let out a piercing whinny that echoed off the canyon walls with an almost supernatural clarity. Margaret felt her heart racing as she watched the magnificent animal's display. In the 2 years since Patrick's death, she had struggled to maintain the ranch while dealing with the constant threat of financial ruin, Apache raids, and the dozens of other dangers that made life in the Arizona Territory a daily gamble with fate. The idea that their horse might possess some supernatural knowledge that could help them save their home seemed too incredible to believe, yet the evidence was right before their eyes. Thomas, ever the practical one, was the first to voice the question that was on everyone's mind. Even if Whisper is trying to tell us something, how are we supposed to understand what it is? His frustration was evident in his voice, but underlying the skepticism was a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to save everything his father had worked so hard to build. Morrison walked slowly toward Whisper, his movements deliberate and non-threatening in the manner of a man who understood that he was dealing with something far beyond an ordinary horse. "Nayati taught me that the old ways of communication are still there for those who know how to use them," he said softly. "Smoke signals, for instance. The Apache have been using them for centuries to send messages across vast distances, and Whisper here might be trying to tell us that we need to reach out for help in the traditional way." The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist, seeming both ridiculous and somehow perfectly logical at the same time. Margaret looked at her sons, seeing her own mixture of desperation and hope reflected in their faces. They had tried everything else to save the ranch, exhausting every conventional option available to them. Perhaps it was time to consider the unconventional. "You're talking about sending smoke signals to the Apache?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Ma, you know what the army says about communicating with the tribes. They could hang us for treason." His concerns were well-founded, as tensions between white settlers and Apache bands had reached a breaking point following a series of raids and counter-raids that had left both sides suspicious of any attempts at communication. Morrison shook his head emphatically. "Not all the Apache are hostile, son. There are still bands living peacefully in the mountains, folks who remember the friendship your pa had with Nayati. If we could get word to them about your situation, they might be willing to help, especially if Whisper's behavior means what I think it means." As he spoke, the horse in question moved to stand directly in front of him, lowering his great head until it was level with Morrison's chest in what appeared to be a gesture of acknowledgement. Margaret made her decision with the sudden clarity that comes to people who have exhausted all other options. "Show us," she said quietly, her Irish accent making the words sound like a prayer. "Show us how to make the smoke signals." The wind that swept down from the Dragoon Mountains carried her words across the devastated ranch, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled overhead, crying out as if answering her plea. Morrison nodded solemnly, understanding that they had just committed themselves to a course of action that would either save the O'Brien ranch or destroy them all. "We'll need dry wood, plenty of it, and something to control the smoke once we get it going," he said, already beginning to plan the logistics of their desperate gamble. "And we'll need to do it from the high ground where the signals can be seen for miles in every direction." As the four humans began gathering materials for their attempt at ancient communication, Whisper continued his strange behavior, pawing at the ground and whinnying softly toward the eastern peaks where the Apache considered their ancestors to dwell. The horse seemed to understand that something momentous was about to happen, something that would determine not only the fate of the O'Brien family but also the complex web of relationships that existed between all the inhabitants of this harsh and beautiful land. The sun was beginning to set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Margaret of the sunsets she had watched from her childhood home in Ireland. But unlike those peaceful evenings of her youth, this sunset marked the beginning of what might be their last desperate attempt to save everything they held dear. The first wisps of smoke began curling skyward from the carefully constructed signal fire as the last rays of sunlight painted the Dragoon Mountains in shades of deep purple and gold. Thomas had positioned the fire on the highest ridge of the O'Brien property, a rocky outcropping that offered an unobstructed view of the surrounding valleys and peaks where Apache bands were known to make their camps. Morrison stood beside him, using a damp blanket to control the smoke according to the ancient patterns that Nayati had taught him during those dangerous months when communication between hostile factions meant the difference between life and death. Margaret and Samuel remained at the base of the ridge, tending to Whisper, whose behavior had become even more extraordinary as the evening progressed. The magnificent stallion now stood perfectly motionless, his head raised toward the eastern peaks where the sacred mountains of Sierra Blanca rose like ancient sentinels against the darkening sky. What made his posture even more remarkable was the fact that his breathing seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the smoke signals, as if he were somehow connected to the messages being sent into the vast wilderness. The smoke rose in carefully controlled puffs, 3 short bursts followed by 2 longer columns, then a single sustained release that hung in the still mountain air like a prayer made visible. Morrison had explained that this particular sequence identified the sender as a friend of Nayati and requested safe passage for important communication, but as the minutes passed without any response, Margaret began to wonder if their desperate gamble had been nothing more than the fantasy of people pushed beyond the limits of rational thought. Just as doubt was beginning to creep into her mind, an answering signal appeared on a distant peak to the northeast, barely visible against the gathering darkness but unmistakably deliberate in its pattern. 3 quick puffs, then 2, then 1, exactly mirroring the message that Morrison and Thomas had been sending into the night. The response sent a chill through all 4 humans, but it was Whisper's reaction that truly amazed them. The horse suddenly threw back his magnificent head and released a sound unlike anything they had ever heard before, a haunting call that seemed to echo off the canyon walls with supernatural resonance. Morrison's weathered face broke into the first smile they had seen from him all day. "They remember," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and wonder. "There are still Apache in these mountains who remember the friendship between Patrick and Nayati, and they're willing to listen to what we have to say." As if to confirm his words, the distant smoke signals changed pattern, indicating that the unseen communicators were requesting a meeting at a specific location that Morrison recognized from his years of experience in Apache territory. "They want us to meet them at Spider Rock Canyon tomorrow at dawn," Morrison translated, reading the smoke patterns with the skill of a man who had learned to interpret such messages as a matter of survival. "It's neutral ground, a place where both sides can come without fear of ambush or treachery." The mention of the sacred canyon caused Whisper to begin moving in tight circles again, but this time his behavior seemed less agitated and more purposeful, as if he were preparing for something important. Samuel looked up at his older brother, who was still tending the signal fire on the ridge above them. "What do we tell them when we meet them?" he asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty of a young man who had never been involved in negotiations that could determine the fate of his family's entire future. "We can't exactly ask them to loan us the money to pay off the bank, and I don't think they're in the cattle business." Margaret had been thinking about the same question, and as she watched Whisper's continued strange behavior, an idea began forming in her mind that seemed both impossible and somehow inevitable. "Maybe we're not supposed to ask them for anything," she said slowly, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "Maybe Whisper's been trying to tell us that there's something here, something Patrick knew about but never told us, something that could save the ranch without putting anyone else at risk." The implications of her words settled over the group like morning mist. Patrick O'Brien had been a man of many secrets, an Irish immigrant who had somehow managed to establish a successful ranch in some of the most dangerous territory in the American Southwest, maintaining peaceful relations with Apache bands while other settlers lived in constant fear of raids. If there was indeed something valuable hidden on the property, something that Patrick had kept secret even from his own family, it would explain both Whisper's behavior and the willingness of the Apache to respond to their smoke signals. Morrison extinguished the signal fire and made his way down the rocky slope to join the others, his movements careful in the treacherous footing of loose stone and hidden crevices. "There's something else," he said as he approached the group. "The way Whisper's been acting, the specific signals the Apache sent back, it all reminds me of something Nayati told me once about the old days, before the big trouble started between our peoples." The older man paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully before continuing. "He said that in the time of his grandfather's grandfather, there were places in these mountains where the Apache and certain white men would meet to trade things that were precious to both sides. Not just furs and tools and such, but information about where to find water during drought years, which passes would be clear of snow in winter, and sometimes knowledge about places where the earth gave up its treasures to those who knew how to look for them." Thomas had rejoined them, his face streaked with soot from tending the fire, but his eyes bright with possibilities that hadn't existed just hours before. "You're talking about treasure, actual buried treasure?" he asked, voicing what they were all thinking. "Like in those dime novels about pirates and lost Spanish gold?" His skepticism was evident, but underneath it was the desperate hope of a man who had watched his family's dreams crumbling and was willing to consider any possibility that might save them. Morrison shook his head, but not in denial. "Not pirates, son, but you're not far wrong about the Spanish. These mountains were full of Spanish explorers and missionaries 300 years ago, and some of them found things they couldn't take with them when they left. Silver, mostly, from mines they worked with Apache labor until the tribes finally drove them out. As he spoke, Whisper moved to stand directly in front of him, the horse's intelligent eyes seeming to bore into the older man's soul with an intensity that made everyone present understand that they were discussing something of profound importance. Margaret felt her heart beginning to race as the pieces of a puzzle that had been forming for years suddenly began to fit together. Patrick's unexplained absences, his detailed knowledge of Apache customs and language, his ability to maintain the ranch during years when other settlers had failed or fled, and most mysteriously of all, his friendship with Nayati, a medicine man whose influence extended far beyond what most white settlers ever realized. Patrick knew, she said quietly, the words coming out like a confession she had been keeping even from herself. All those times he would disappear for days at a time, claiming he was checking on distant pastures or tracking strays, he was meeting with Nayati and learning things that no other white man in the territory knew. The wind that swept down from the peaks carried the scent of sage and juniper, reminding her of the smells that had always clung to Patrick's clothes when he returned from his mysterious journeys. Samuel was examining Whisper more closely, studying the patterns the horse had been scratching in the earth with his hooves. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the marks in the muddy ground. "It's not random at all. 3 scratches, then 2, then 1, just like the smoke signals. And this longer line here, it's pointing directly toward that outcropping where the old mine shaft is, the one Pa always told us to stay away from because it was dangerous." The mention of the abandoned mine shaft sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. Patrick had indeed warned his sons away from the rocky area where Spanish miners had once worked, claiming that the old timbers were rotten and the shaft was filled with poisonous gases that could kill a man in minutes. But now, in light of everything they had learned, his warnings took on a different meaning entirely. Morrison was already moving toward the area Samuel had indicated, his experienced prospector's eye studying the terrain with new understanding. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered as he examined the rocky outcropping that had always seemed like just another geological formation in a landscape full of them. "I've ridden past this spot 100 times and never really looked at it, but now that I know what to look for, it's obvious as the nose on your face." What Morrison had recognized was a series of subtle markers that would have meant nothing to the casual observer but which told a clear story to anyone who understood the methods used by Spanish miners in the previous century. Carefully placed stones that indicated the presence of worked shafts, scratches on rock faces that marked the boundaries of claims, and most telling of all, a small pile of slag that had been deliberately concealed but which still showed traces of silver ore. Thomas and Samuel joined Morrison at the site, their excitement growing as they began to understand the magnitude of what their father had been protecting all these years. The mine shaft itself was indeed dangerous, partially collapsed and filled with debris from decades of neglect, but the signs of extensive mining activity were unmistakable. More importantly, the positioning of the markers suggested that the main workings extended far beyond the visible shaft, possibly connecting to a network of tunnels that honeycombed the entire ridge. Whisper had followed them to the mine site, and his behavior became even more extraordinary as they explored the area. The horse seemed to be guiding them toward specific locations, pawing at the ground in places where closer examination revealed additional evidence of mining activity. It was as if the magnificent animal possessed knowledge that had been passed down through some mystical connection to the previous inhabitants of this ancient landscape. Margaret stood at the entrance to the partially collapsed shaft, feeling the cool air that flowed up from the depths below and trying to imagine her husband exploring these dangerous passages by lamplight, mapping the extent of workings that had been abandoned for more than 2 centuries. The thought filled her with both pride and sorrow, pride for Patrick's courage and vision in preserving this secret, and sorrow that he had died before he could share it with the family he had worked so hard to protect. "There's something else down there," Samuel called from a position deeper in the shaft where he had been examining the walls with a torch improvised from a piece of broken timber. The Spanish didn't just mine silver here, they were using this place for something else, something that required a lot more security than a simple mining operation would need. His voice carried an excitement that was infectious, and the others gathered around him to see what he had discovered. The walls of the shaft were covered with markings that went far beyond the simple scratches that miners typically made to mark their progress. These were elaborate symbols that combined Spanish religious iconography with Apache spiritual designs, creating a unique artistic fusion that spoke of cooperation between 2 cultures that history generally portrayed as being in constant conflict. The complexity and artistry of the markings suggested that this site had been used for purposes that went far beyond mere commercial mining. Morrison studied the symbols with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. I've seen marks like these before, in places where Spanish missionaries worked with Apache medicine men to hide things that both sides considered too valuable to risk losing in the wars that were always breaking out between the colonies and the tribes. His words carried the weight of hard-won experience, and the others listened with growing amazement as he explained the historical context of what they were seeing. The Spanish weren't just looking for silver and gold, Morrison continued, his voice taking on the reverent tone of a man discussing sacred matters. They were also trying to preserve knowledge, maps and documents that showed the locations of other mines, water sources, safe passages through hostile territory, all the information that meant survival in this harsh country. And the Apache, for their part, were protecting their own sacred sites and burial grounds from being desecrated by treasure hunters who didn't understand the spiritual significance of what they were destroying. The implications of Morrison's explanation were staggering. If the O'Brien Ranch sat on top of not just a silver mine but a repository of historical documents and maps that showed the locations of other valuable sites throughout the territory, then the property was worth far more than any of them had ever imagined. More importantly, it explained why Nayati had been so interested in maintaining his friendship with Patrick, and why the Apache were willing to respond to their smoke signals even in these tense times. Thomas was already making plans, his practical mind racing ahead to the logistics of exploration and extraction. "We'll need proper equipment to explore the deeper passages safely," he said, examining the construction of the shaft with the eye of someone who understood the principles of mining engineering. "And we'll need to move carefully, both because of the physical dangers and because we don't want to attract attention from claim jumpers or government officials who might try to take the site away from us." Samuel nodded in agreement, but his thoughts were focused on a different aspect of their discovery. "What about the Apache?" he asked. "If this site is as important to them as Morrison says it is, they're not going to be happy about us disturbing it, even if we have good intentions." His concerns were well-founded, as the history of the territory was littered with conflicts that had started over misunderstandings about sacred sites and mineral rights. Morrison's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the younger man's question. "That's why the meeting tomorrow is so important," he said finally. "We need to approach this with respect for both sides, understanding that what we've found here represents something much more significant than just another mining claim. If we handle this right, it could be the beginning of a new kind of cooperation between our peoples, something that honors both Patrick's memory and Nayati's wisdom." As they prepared to leave the mine site and return to the ranch house, Whisper performed one final mysterious action that left them all speechless with wonder. The magnificent stallion walked to a specific point near the entrance to the shaft and began pawing at the ground with systematic precision, eventually uncovering a flat stone that had been carefully placed to conceal something beneath it. When Thomas lifted the stone, he found a leather-wrapped package that had been protected from the elements by its underground hiding place for what appeared to be many years. Inside the package were documents that confirmed everything Morrison had theorized about the site's historical significance. Spanish colonial maps showing the locations of mines throughout the territory, Apache tribal markings indicating the boundaries of sacred areas, and most remarkably of all, a letter written in Patrick's own hand, addressed to his family and dated just weeks before his death. The letter explained everything: Patrick's discovery of the site, his negotiations with Nayati to preserve its secrets, and his plans for eventually using the wealth it contained to secure his family's future while respecting the spiritual significance it held for the Apache people. Margaret read the letter aloud in the flickering light of their torches, her voice breaking with emotion as she realized the full extent of her husband's sacrifice and vision. Patrick had known that he was dying, and he had spent his final months preparing for this moment, training Whisper to guide his family to the site when the time was right and arranging for the Apache to provide the assistance and protection that would be needed to extract the treasure safely. The horse's supernatural behavior, the willingness of the Apache to respond to their smoke signals, even the devastating storm that had forced them to seek desperate solutions, all of it had been part of a larger plan that Patrick had set in motion before his death. As they walked back toward the ranch house under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than usual, each member of the group was lost in their own thoughts about the extraordinary day they had just experienced. The financial crisis that had seemed so insurmountable that morning now appeared to be just the beginning of a much larger adventure, one that would require courage, wisdom, and above all, respect for the complex history that had brought them to this moment. Tomorrow's meeting with the Apache would determine whether they could successfully navigate the challenges that lay ahead, but tonight, for the first time since Patrick's death, the O'Brien family felt hope returning to their hearts like spring water flowing into a desert oasis.